But let's get started with Alabama, okay? So the day that we are recording this, Jameson Williams declared for the NFL draft. And this is very interesting because John Metchie has not. I thought Metchie would have been the first of the two to decide that he was going to the NFL draft, but we'll wait and see on this. And this is interesting because Williams' greatest asset is his 4.3 speed. He blew out his ACL in the national championship game against Georgia. I will be interested to see how NFL teams evaluate Jameson Williams going into the next 3 months because Jameson Williams is the number one wide receiver available in this draft. Ohio State fans, I understand. Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson. But neither one of those dudes can run like this dude, okay? John Metchie is not the best wide receiver in this class, though he's a top 10 wide receiver. It'll be interesting to see if he wants to come back and rehab and be the number one once again at Alabama, as he was the number one at Alabama this year with 96 catches. Williams, 79 catches, 1,600 yards, was a big play, dude, and you could see both of those guys had their roles in the offense, and Bryce Young and, quite frankly, Alabama missed both of them in their carved roles. Metchie being your possession guy, your short, fast dude that he's not Tyreek Hill, but he plays that position. You understand what I'm saying? He could play in the slot for you in the NFL and really do a lot of work there. I think of him as a supercharged Julian Edelman, if you're that type, or perhaps a supercharged Chris Godwin, if you're that type. I'm also really interested to see what this means for Alabama and how they choose to condition in the offseason because, little inside college football here. The strength coach is the dude that usually gets called onto the carpet when you have ACL injuries, especially when you have the same type of injuries to the same type of player, right? So knowing that Metchie and Williams blew out their ACLs in more or less 3 games apart, you're going to want to take a look at that if you are Nick Saban. The other thing you're going to want to take a look at is what is your wide receiver group looking like? I wrote about this at foxsports.com. Holman Wiggins has built a reputation as Alabama's wide receiver coach among the best, if not the best, in the sport at doing it. I think it's him and Dennis Simmons, who's now at USC. Holman Wiggins developed Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, and now Metchie and Williams. Between him and Nick Saban, you could say the wide receiving corps has been the strongest position for Alabama outside of their quarterback position, and you might even say it was better than their quarterback position or even their offensive line position. I think the only comps here are like Ryan Day and Lincoln Riley in developing quarterbacks. So seeing how he develops Ja'Cory Brooks, seeing how he develops Ajay Hall, seeing how he develops Trayshawn Holden, these are all things that I'm very interested in, as I think Alabama is going to have a hard time with its wide receiving core in crunch time next year if they can't develop those dudes into the kind of players they need to be, because those guys were dropping passes in the national championship game, and those are passes they got to hold on to. Like if Ajay Hall makes a catch here, Trayshawn Holden makes a catch here, Ja'Cory Brooks makes a catch here, you're probably still in that game late and you don't get your butt kicked in the fourth quarter of the national championship game. All right. I want to talk a little bit about Bama's other deficient position, which I think is corner right now. Look, Jay Valai announced the day after the national championship game he is the new co-defense coordinator, nickel, and cornerback coach at Oklahoma. Alabama fans might not think that is such a loss given how their corners played in the national championship game. Kool-Aid McKinstry got stirred like somebody found an extra cup of sugar. George Pickens was eating him up. Khyree Jackson, who was the former number 1 junior college cornerback in the country, also got ate up by Georgia wide receivers. Josh Jobe, who began the season as the number 1 corner at Alabama, will enter the NFL draft. I think this is an interesting spot for Nick Saban to find a great corner and or defensive backs coach, because he is a defensive back, right? He's a defensive backs coach. And I think Carl Scott, who's late of the Minnesota Vikings staff, might actually be interested in that job once again. He's been up for a number of jobs. I think if you can lure him back to Alabama, perhaps You're talking about another Pat Surtain II, right? You're getting back to developing the kind of corners that nobody wants to throw at, whereas I felt the last 3 to 4 games of the season, everybody was going at Alabama's corners, and we're just not used to that. We're not used to seeing Jordan Battle not being in control back there at the safety position. So I'll be interested to see what they do about that and how they accommodate for talented cornerbacks but not experienced cornerbacks, and how much hands-on Nick Saban has when we're talking about developing his defense backs and corners. Or maybe they move Brian Branch or Malachi Moore out. But I need to add this. Alabama fans are yelling at me right now. Elias Ricks is transferring from LSU to Alabama. Eli Ricks, one of the great corners, slot corners, defensive backs in 2022 in college football. It's a boon for them to get him. I think he's going to take one of those spots either from Khyree Jackson or JaQuincy McKinstry, who both of those dudes might not actually be starting next year. We'll see. But yes, Eli Ricks is going to certainly help you with the loss of a Josh Jobe there. Okay. Now, another question I have after the season has ended has to do with Ohio State and Ohio State's receiving corps, quite honestly. I mentioned earlier Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson declared for the NFL draft. Chris Olave actually came back last year when he could have been eligible, probably been a first-round pick, and decided to play one more year and try to get to a national championship game. Didn't go that way. Garrett Wilson declares before the Rose Bowl. So the question wasn't who's the number one. It's Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who was the best wide receiver for Ohio State last year, even as he was not the number one wide receiver at Ohio State last year. He just played a different position. He's playing in the slot. And then, of course, he set a record for most receiving yards in a bowl game with 347 against Utah in what I thought was the best bowl game of the season, quite honestly. And the guys that can help him out that I think are going to step up for the losses of Olave and Wilson have to be Marvin Harrison Jr., who tied the Rose Bowl record for most receiving touchdowns in a game with 3, and Julian Fleming, who is a former number 1 overall wide receiver for the class of 2020. You also have Emeka Egbuka, who is the number 1 overall receiver for the class of 2021. All 3 of those dudes are back at Ohio State, are going to join JSN in that receiving corps. It's just about which one of those guys is going to ascend to those top 2 spots, because we know from 4 years of Ryan Day and that offense that it's really a 3-receiver system where they kind of sort of throw the ball to the tight end and they kind of sort of throw the ball to the running backs, but mostly it's 3 receivers, and really 2 of them are going to get most of the targets. Jaxon Smith-Njigba was just doing so much and so great in the slot that he exceeded expectations in many ways. And I need to add this. The number 1 wide receiver in the 2022 NFL draft, as I mentioned, is Jameson Williams. Jameson Williams was battling Jaxon Smith-Njigba for snaps in 2020. That is how you should view Jaxon Smith-Njigba. You should view him as the number 1 wide receiver heading into the 2022 season until such time as somebody else usurps him, okay? That's how good they are at Ohio State. I also think that Travion Henderson is going to get his touches, and quite honestly is going to be a threat in the passing game. Swing passes, in the flat, on releases, because he's going to have that year in the system and year as a starter. There is no Master Teague for him to contend with. Mayan Williams, meatball, pork chop, whatever he wants to be called now, he's probably going to be the spell back there. I expect Travion Henderson to take on a larger role along with Jaxon Smith-Njigba in 2022, as it's CJ Stroud's team now. There's no quarterback controversy in the way that there was last year, even as they added Devin Brown, who we'll talk about here in a little bit. Thanks for watching this video, and remember, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any other videos on the #1 Ranked Show YouTube channel.